Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, my. It is so wonderful to see all of you in here this afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, my goodness, we have so much representation in the room from so many different areas of the university. I'm just overwhelmed and gratified to see everybody in here today. I cannot recognize everyone right now that I need to mention, only because we're running, of course, a few minutes behind. I want to catch us up. But I would be remiss if I did not recognize the fact that we have, I think, 17 of 18 Ecuadorian students included in our audience today. Is that true, Panji? Where's Panji? Okay. All right, you guys want to stand up and be recognized? Welcome. See, that's a Wildcat Nation welcome right there. Okay? All you have to do is show up and you'll get a round of applause. Okay? I also want to mention that we have representatives from our local chapter of AAUNW. Are some of you ladies in the house? Okay, all right, well, stand up and be recognized. Okay, very fine. Thank you, ladies. And we have countless administrators and faculty members. We have our athletic rep over there, and Dr. B. Stoney, and we've got Fred Charlie. We've got Jackie Hartman. It's like, if I haven't called your name, it's just only because I don't have time to work this long list. But I just want to tell you that I am thrilled to have all of you here. We're going to have a good fellowship with one another as part of what has been an absolutely amazing and fabulous week. So many have done so much to make this week successful. And so many of you in this room have been supporting not just this event, but another event, other events. And listen, I'm truly grateful for the example that you set for everyone in the way that you have participated. So just give yourselves a round of applause for just being so consciously correct. Yeah. All right. Well, you know, we always want to start with some kind of meditation. You know, we weren't guaranteed to be here today. We are not even entitled to be here today. We're only here because of somebody's grace. And so, you know, don't take a thing at all for granted. This life is a precarious thing. And you may be flying very high one moment, but you also may be smacked down pretty low the next. So any day that you get up and you're in your right mind, you're in your right health, listen, you're feeling pretty good, you're being your most inclusive, oh, Lord, it's a good day. So we got to show that we recognize that by pausing at least for a second to just remember and be thankful. So we'll just take 1 minute for you to do whatever you do or not do, as the case may be, all right? We can handle all of that. And then, sir, when I give you the nod over there at our mixing board, then you can then hit the button on our other commemorative piece. You know, this is a very auspicious year. It is the 50th anniversary of the Selma Montgomery March. Some of us are 50 and plus. So those young ones in the audience who think, oh, my goodness, that took place probably about 5 centuries ago. That's ancient history. The history is not so ancient. And so we will do our meditative thing, and then we'll be followed by this video. So let's just take a moment and silently do whatever we do.
President Johnson addresses a joint session of Congress to push a voting rights bill aimed at ending discrimination. It would appoint federal voting registrars in some instances and put an end to complicated literacy tests and other hampering tactics. The president referred to the events in Selma as an American tragedy. And throughout the nation, even in Canada, there were marches through the streets of towns and cities. In New York's Harlem, more than 15,000, half of them white, filed somberly through the streets in quiet but agonized protest. The events in Selma had been brought to a climax by a nighttime attack on a white Boston minister by white men. He died 2 days later, many feeling he suffered martyrdom in the cause of civil rights and voting discrimination. The next day, 4 men were held for his murder. For the Reverend James J. Reeb, the demonstrators write his epitaph with this tribute. Selma sprang overnight from an obscure southern town to the front pages of world newspapers. This church was headquarters in the Negro drive for the right to vote, and it was here that Martin Luther King came to lend his support to the campaign. He pointed out that from Selma's 14,000 Negroes, only a few more than 300 had been registered at the polls. When one group set out to march to the Capitol at Montgomery, the procession was broken up violently by state troopers and sheriff's deputies. Then Dr. King led another contingent through the town. This time, there is no violence. The 1,000 Negroes and 400 white ministers and civil rights workers reach the end of the bridge where the cordon of troopers stand. They are ordered to turn back. Dr. King confers with the police as the marchers hold their ground. He requests that they be allowed to pray. There are a few minutes of mounting tension. The request to pray is granted, and they kneel in the streets. Informants say that Dr. King turned his marchers at the behest of the White House, an arrangement that had been made in advance to avoid a confrontation that could only end in bloodshed. The troops and deputies stand stolidly by as the prayers are said and the marchers go back to Selma. This Alabama town will go down in the history books as a turning point in the civil rights drive. From the halls of Congress to the smallest crossroads hamlet, people can understand the plea that no American can have freedom and justice unless there is freedom and justice for all. In Selma, there is a lesson to be learned.
I would like to now proceed with the blessing of the meal. It's quite all right. If any of you have begun, that's fine. That's no problem. You can bless things at any point. So I saw a couple of people go like, it's quite all right. I'd like to ask Reverend Joanne Killingsworth. She's a guest from Washington, D.C., visiting our campus for the weekend. We're delighted to have her here with Mr. Joseph Searles, one of our very esteemed alums who is also here. And so, Reverend Killingsworth, would you bless the meal, please?
Can we bow our heads? Father, we bless you today, and we give you thanks and we give you praise. We thank you for being in the United States of America. We thank you for the freedoms, oh God, of this country. We thank you for the many blessings that we've received by commerce, by farmers, by businessmen, all to bring the blessings to the table that we are partaking of today. And Father, now we thank you and ask that you might bless this food, bless our conversation and fellowship. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Please enjoy your meal. I'll be back shortly. Thank you. All right, everybody. I'd like to call us back to order, please. Thank you. This is what the fellowship luncheon is about. All this fellowshipping that's going on at these tables. It's just so wonderful to see all of you talking and smiling, and I hope feeling really good. This is just marvelous. Thank you so much. We're going to move on now with the remainder of our program. I just want to say to the College of Education that you guys are here in full effect. You turned out for your College of Education Professor Emeritus, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, and then you must have turned out for this Professor Emeritus from the College of Education in the University of North Florida. So you're like, okay, if you bring somebody here from the College of Education, we're turning out. All right, all you College of Education people, let me just give you a round of applause. Our College of Arts and Sciences has brought a huge contingent of people. All of our areas are represented. So many of you have come from so many different areas of the campus. Thank you all so much for being here. It's absolutely wonderful having you. Now it's my great pleasure to ask someone who is extremely dear to all of us who know anything about the history and the who's who of K-State. And you know, there are certain people that rise to the station of royalty, K-State royalty. People that have done so much to advance multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion, who've done so much in the classroom, who has done so much in the community, and who is in the pulpit every Sunday. I mean, this is an amazing man. We all continue to draw inspiration from him. I have the deepest, deepest, deepest respect for him. So I bring to you one of K-State's true royal individuals, the Reverend Dr. James Boyer.
Thank you. You're much too kind. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not the speaker. Thank you. Thank you so very much. As Dr. Gordon was introducing me, I thought about the mother and the 10-year-old son who were attending the funeral of the father. And they were saying so many nice things about the father till the mother hunched the boy and said, "Go up there, boy, and see if that's your daddy in the coffin." I was so honored to get the call from Dr. Gordon to introduce my friend, our keynote speaker for today. I just want to, you see the bio in the program, but I want to tell you that almost 25 years ago, I had gone to Las Vegas to a conference and it was my first trip to Las Vegas. Nobody told me you got to go past the slot machines to get to your room. And I happened to be anti-gambler, and so there we were. But a group of us, called by Rose Duhan, a K-State graduate, met in a room in Las Vegas to talk about organizing a national organization called the National Association for Multicultural Education. And at that time, many of us were black and Mexican American, but there was always one white boy in the midst. And that one white boy is our guest speaker today. Dr. Pritchy Smith has for years been an agent, a spokesperson, a writer, a consultant, an educator committed to diversity in all of its dimensions. He writes a lot. Writing for me is painful. Mike Holden made me do it when I was a professor, but it's painful. It was wonderful, though, for Dr. Smith to be among us when we were trying to get a national visibility level for multicultural education and social justice. Dr. Smith has served so much time at the University of Northern Florida, and incidentally, Florida is my home state, but I don't think I've ever been to his campus. Thank you for coming to our campus. Dr. Smith is not only a writer and a producer of all kinds of materials for diversity, but he has taught in historically black colleges. He goes to Belize. He has spent so much of his energy promoting the elements of diversity and social justice. And so he's coming to us now. My friend from Florida, who was always the white boy among us, who made us feel real comfortable, Dr. Pritchy Smith. Would you welcome him, please?
Thank you, Dr. Boyer, for those kind words of introduction. It's really good to see you again.
Thank you.
For those of you who do not know, Dr. Boyer is one of an elite 4 or 5 of the earliest professors and scholars in the field of multicultural teacher education. And he's recognized nationally for mentoring many of the second-generation scholars in the field, including me. So thank you for your contributions, Dr. Boyer.
Thank you.
I'm honored to have been invited by Dr. Myra Gordon to speak at Kansas State University's Martin Luther King Jr. Fellowship Luncheon. One of the reasons I feel honored is K-State's rich history of honoring Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy, beginning, of course, with his famous 1968 speech, The Future of Integration, delivered here on K-State's campus a little less than 3 months before he was assassinated. And today, of course, we're gathered again to pay homage to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to celebrate the legacy of a great American who helped set this nation on a new course, a new direction that forced the United States to fulfill its promise of democracy to all its citizens. We are not there yet, but let us remember Dr. King's words. The arc of a moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I've titled today's talk, Growing a Soul for Social Justice. In her book, Writing to Change the World, Mary Pfeiffer wrote these words: "The finest thing we can do in life is to grow a soul and then use it in the service of humankind." She went on to write, "We writers may not live to see the changes that we work for, but readers will enjoy the shade of the trees we have planted." I think the same is true, not just for writers, but for any of us who want to see our nation become a more fair and just democracy. Dr. Gordon, I know I promised that I would talk about social justice, and I will. Okay. But one cannot talk about social justice in our nation without also talking about bigotry. The one thing that should be clear to almost everyone in this room is that the root of most injustice in our society is bigotry, and particularly that form of bigotry we call racism. The behavioral law is rather simple. Bigotry plus power equals injustice. Now, some of you in the audience at this very moment may be asking yourselves, why in the world is the old white man with the ponytail standing before the microphone? What in the world does he know about social justice and bigotry, particularly racism? Well, before I have finished today, I hope I've convinced most of you that eradicating bigotry and achieving social justice in the United States are the responsibilities of us all, most especially the responsibility of those of us privileged to be educators and university students, and absolutely the responsibility of every one of this nation's political, business, educational, civic, and religious leaders. And yes, I am going to talk about social justice and racism, but not racism alone. Indeed, it is true that racism cuts deeply into the fabric of our society, but it is the bigger beast of bigotry that wields the sword, that continues to prune back this nation, that prevents this nation from flowering into the full democracy it could become. In my mind, bigotry is bigotry, whether it is based on race, ethnicity, language, or culture, or whether it is based on income level, gender, sexual orientation, or any other characteristic that might mark one as somehow different. Bigotry is bigotry, whether a person supports his or her bigotry by some personal philosophy or by the scriptures of some holy text. And those of you in the audience who have heard me speak before know that I always do two things. The first is that I tell a story, no matter who the audience is, for I believe it is in the voices of rather ordinary people that we find the great lessons of life played out. And the second thing I try to do is extract a few truths from that story. Dr. Gardner, I know I promised to not talk too long, too. I promise to be brief no matter how long it takes.
You just do what you have to do, Dr.
Okay.
Do what you have to do.
All right. I'm not an authority on social justice or racism, but I have thought about both of them ever since I was an undergraduate student at the University of Texas in 1959. And the story I'm going to tell is a personal story. My personal experience, if not the best, is the only lens I have for examining injustice and its relationship to bigotry. When I first wrote this story, really many years ago now, I titled it TJ and Me, The Education of a White Boy. It's the story of an experience I had at the University of Texas in the summer of 1959, an experience that would change profoundly for me for the rest of my life, the way I would look at the world around me. It's the story of how I think I first began to grow a soul for social justice when I was a young adult. I was enrolled that summer in a Foundations of Education course, and in that class was a student named Thomas Jefferson Johnson, who preferred to be called TJ for short. For the most part, schools were still segregated in Texas. In fact, in all my 15 years of schooling that I'd had prior to that particular class, TJ was my first African-American classmate. In the beginning, perhaps TJ was only a curiosity to me, but something inside me told me that I wanted to know this young man better. And one day when I was on my way to class, TJ called out to me from where he was sitting under one of those grand spreading oak trees you find on the University of Texas campus. "Hey, Smith, you want a cup of coffee?" Well, the idea sounded good to me. After all, I was growing up. I was 20 years old. I was away at college drinking coffee now like a regular grown-up man. Something college students did in those days, whether they really liked the bitter taste of coffee or not. We began to meet under that oak tree, and TJ would pull out from his briefcase a thermos and pour me a cup of coffee. We began to have coffee under that oak tree, almost like a ritual, sometimes before and sometimes after class. At these meetings where TJ and I would drink coffee and talk, I learned that TJ was a French teacher in a segregated black high school in Abilene, Texas. He was at the University of Texas, much like I was, to complete a degree and get a teaching certificate. And I began comparing myself to TJ, as sometimes naive white folks will do. And I was chagrined that his vocabulary of English words far exceeded mine, and that his pronunciation in French seemed flawless to me, a white boy who, even though I had 14 credit hours of college-level French, still pronounced such phrases as "Merci beaucoup, mademoiselle," with those long, flat, diphthong Texas vowel sounds. As you may have discovered by now, out there in the audience, I'm living proof that phonics just doesn't work. I could see that TJ was far more sophisticated and more intelligent than I was. And sometimes TJ talked about becoming a great teacher, as if teaching were some special calling. I had never before heard anyone talk about teaching as TJ did. And he also said things sometimes that frightened me. He used phrases I had never heard before, phrases like the movement and phrases like freedom for the people. You see, in order to understand the importance of my encounter with TJ, you have to remember what it was like in 1959. Neither TJ nor I were really supposed to be at the University of Texas. TJ because he was black, and I because I was what some of the white fraternity boys called white trash. After all, I wasn't the son of a banker or a doctor or a lawyer or some well-to-do businessman. I was just straight off the farm. I was so politically naive that it hadn't even occurred to me that the reason that TJ and I were drinking coffee from a thermos bottle was that there really were no racially integrated cafes or lunch counters where the two of us could sit down together in the Austin, Texas of 1959. On Friday night, about midway through the semester, I was strolling by myself down Guadalupe Street, known as the drag to college students in those days. And as I passed the Longhorn Theater, a movie house, I noticed a strange phenomenon. The line of people in front of the Longhorn Theater stretched the entire length of the block. And I noticed the line was really a double line of partners, one black and one white. And then I heard someone call out to me, "Pritchy, over here, over here." And I looked around to see TJ standing in this unusual line of people. And I walked over and he asked, "Why don't you join us, Pritchy?" And I asked in return, "Well, what in the world are you doing, TJ?" And he retorted, "We're trying to integrate the theater, fool." He said, "This is how it works. You see, we stand in line, in tandem, a black and white." Of course, I didn't know what in tandem meant. And tie up the line so that people who really want to see the movie give up and go home instead of standing in line all night to get their tickets. When we get up to the ticket window, we ask if we can buy a ticket. And of course, the ticket seller says no, and we go back to the end of the line and start over. It's a kind of boycott, Pritchy. The theater owner is either going to have to integrate the theater or go broke. And TJ asked again, Pritchy, why don't you join us? And I faltered as I tried to speak. I stammered, I don't know. I don't think so. After all, at 20 years old, I had never in my life taken a public action against anything. I had never even stood up for myself when I had been done a wrong, much less ever stand up or against authority that had done someone else a wrong. And I remember clearly, in less than a second, the expression on TJ's face changed, and his smiling face became stoic and hard. His eyes transformed suddenly from that bright twinkle I had known to the piercing, cold, steely stare. And with eyes of ice, he looked straight into my eyes and he said, Pritchy, if you're not in this line, you're in the wrong line. And then he looked away from me. And I felt my scalp tighten, and I felt chills run up my spine. I began to back away, almost stumbling from the impact of his words on me as I continued walking down the street. As I walked, his words kept ringing in my ears. I kept hearing over and over inside my head, Pritchy, if you're not in this line, you're in the wrong line. And I thought about those words all weekend, again and again. Pritchy, if you're not in this line, you're in the wrong line. And I tried to understand what was happening inside me. I had no prior social context within which to place this kind of experience. You have to remember that this was prior to my knowledge of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. and the Montgomery bus boycott, and of course the later Selma March. I worried about TJ's words all weekend. On Monday, I started the class early. I just had to see TJ. And I went to the oak tree, and TJ was not there. I went to class. TJ was not in class. The next class day, TJ was neither at the oak tree nor in class again. A whole week passed, no TJ. Then the following week, TJ was seated in the classroom. And acting like nothing had happened the week before, I said, hi, TJ, let's have coffee after class. And TJ didn't look at me. He didn't speak. He looked past me with those same icy eyes I had seen on that Friday night in front of the theater. And after class, without a word, he walked past me and out the door. And it seemed to me that TJ had cut me out of his world. Well, another week passed, and finally, when I could no longer stand this inner turmoil that I was feeling, I joined the boycott, an experience that was to affect me forever. As you might expect, some bad things happened before the protest ended. For example, one night, policemen leaped from trucks swinging their nightsticks. I'd never seen policemen swing nightsticks as they plunged into a panicked crowd, hitting men and women in their stomachs and heads. And I was terrified by the shrieks and the cries from the panicked crowd of protesters, and even more terrified by the blood that was being splattered on me as police hit people as they were coming closer and closer to me, where I was pinned by the crowd against the building. And I could see these uniformed men were not just trying to break up a protest. It seemed like they wanted to kill us. Of course, I was lucky that night. I survived without any kind of major injury. But it was that night that I realized for the first time that police in those days were there to preserve a racist social order, not to protect protesters who were exercising their constitutional right to assemble peacefully. And I also realized that night that I lost some of my white privilege when I stood side by side with people of color on a matter of injustice. I noticed thereafter several of my white friends disassociated themselves from me. At the end of that hot summer in August, TJ and I parted ways. TJ had to return to Abilene to start a new school year, even though, as TJ said, Pritchy, most of the kids at the Negro school will be picking cotton until the end of September. We met one last time under the oak tree. The Longhorn Theater was still segregated, and we felt surrounded by the kind of sadness a person experiences when he tries as hard as he can but doesn't win. The sadness of an unachieved triumph. It was the feeling Langston Hughes might have been trying to capture when he wrote about a dream deferred. As hard as we had tried, we felt like we'd failed. We didn't know at that moment that it would be nearly another year before the owner of the Longhorn Theater would stand before the crowd of protesters and announce that henceforth the doors of the theater would be open to all. Oh, it would be a great moment of triumph with the crowd cheering and tossing their caps and signs into the air. A moment that TJ would not be there to experience. We had met at the oak tree to have one last cup of coffee and say goodbye, but we didn't seem to know how. When it came time for TJ to leave, there was this awkward, uneasy moment, as if both of us were groping for some words that would sound right, like so often happens, I think, when men just don't know how to act. Then TJ broke the silence and said, "Smith, you're okay for a white boy. You're going to be all right." Well, I stood there a good long while, watching TJ grow smaller as he walked down the street toward the bus station. Now I remember feeling like something in the world had changed that summer, like I wasn't ever going to be the same again, like maybe I knew for the first time that people have a choice. They can stand in the wrong line, or they can stand in the right line. On that last day that I would see TJ, there was simply no way that we could have known that TJ, just about 5 years later, would be killed in the Vietnam War. It was just a few years ago, in fact, that I found myself standing before the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., weeping almost uncontrollably as I touched my fingers to the letters of his name carved in the stone. And the only words I could whisper aloud that day were, "Well, TJ, you did become a great teacher." I learned many things from TJ in our experience with the boycott. Far too many things, in fact, than I can tell about in the limited time I have for speaking today. However, the most important thing I learned was about myself. I found out that it would take far more than just learning how to drink bitter coffee to become a man. I learned that I could not stand up as a man until I stood up first for someone else, and that I would not become a man until I stood against injustice. It was a single lesson that would enable me later on in life to understand the full meaning of Martin Niemöller's famous words when I would read them for the first time. I'm referring, of course, to Niemöller's passage about his silence and inaction in Nazi Germany when he said these words. "First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak out for me." Audre Lorde put it this way: "Your silence will not protect you." And Dr. Martin Luther King, the man whose life we're honoring today, captured the same idea in his famous letter from Birmingham jail when he wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." So, as I've said, one of the important things I learned from TJ about growing a soul for social justice was to speak out against injustice, to stand in the right line, as he put it. Or as my mother often said, although I wasn't listening, sometimes doing the right thing is more important than doing a thing right, she would say. However, the second thing I learned from TJ is that doing the right thing requires moral courage. Perhaps no one has said this any better than Robert F. Kennedy when he spoke in his famous 1966 Day of Affirmation speech in South Africa these words: "Each time a person stands for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." And he went on to say, "Few are willing to embrace the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. And yet, it is the one essential vital quality for those who seek to change a world that yields most painfully to change." Now, many of my generation, of course, were shaped by the civil rights and peace movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We naively thought that we were going to change the world. In fact, maybe for a brief moment in time, we did change part of the United States. But as you're all aware, over the past 3 decades, a wave of neoconservatism has reversed many of the gains we made toward an equitable society in the 1960s and 70s. Today, the public schools are more segregated by race and social class than they were back in 1969, just 1 year after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Today, the children of the privileged, on average, receive twice the per-pupil expenditure that is spent on poor children. Today, privileged white students occupy over 90% of the seats in gifted classes and AP classes. In 2001, I'm sure you remember, the 1968 Bilingual Education Act was completely eliminated in President George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind Act. And then in the broader society, the same trend of reversing many of the gains of the civil rights movement can be seen. Today, the 1965 Voting Rights Act has been almost gutted by the majority conservative U.S. Supreme Court. And a wave of new Jim Crow laws has emerged to restrict minority voting rights in many of the red states. And today, the same court has all but eliminated affirmative action in our public universities and professional schools of medicine and law. And today, the income gap between the rich and the poor is greater than any time since the Great Depression. And of course, national demonstrations over the Michael Brown and Eric Garner cases remind us that despite the progress made, there remains a racial divide in America. We are also reminded that police brutality and overreaction too often seem racially motivated in our nation. I can see little difference between the police brutality TJ and I witnessed in 1959 and that reported in some of the recent high-profile cases. We cannot help but be saddened also by the deaths of 18-year-old Trayvon Martin and 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Some of us are crying tears of sadness and grief, and at the same time crying out in anger. We ask, is there no justice? We are also saddened by the disappointment we sometimes feel about our nation's shortcomings regarding justice. Sometimes we feel about the United States like Camus felt about his native France when he lamented, "I should like to be able to love my country and still love justice." I see many of you in the audience out there as the next generation of leaders committed to social justice. I entrust you, in fact, the next generation, to do a better job than did my generation. With a tiny ripple of hope, in fact, I can only say to you, if you want to make a difference and honor Dr. King's legacy, remember. Remember his words, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If you're a professor at this great university and you want to honor Dr. King's legacy by making a difference, do research. Conduct research that gives voice to the poor. Conduct research that peels away layer by layer the lies that prevent so many people from seeing the oppression that exists in our nation. If you're a teacher and you want to honor Dr. King's legacy by making a difference, teach. Teach for social justice. Empower the poor and the marginalized to overthrow the structures of power that keep systemic oppression in place. If you're a political, business, educational, civic, or religious leader, and you want to honor Dr. King's legacy by making a difference, lead. Lead by example. Live a life committed to social justice. Lead to eradicate the bigotry that makes a mockery of democracy. Simply put, if you want to honor Dr. King's legacy, grow a soul for social justice. As Mary Pfeiffer wrote, it's the finest thing we can do. Thank you.
Wow. I never in my life heard anybody speak so softly and hit you with such a major message. I think we need to put our hands together again. Wow. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's not much to say after that, except I want to thank you all so very, very much for being here today, for listening to this message. I believe that we at K-State want to find the right line and get in it. I honestly believe that we are just full of good people. And maybe our biggest problem is we just don't even know where the line is. But I have the feeling that if we know where the line is, more of us will get in that line than the wrong line. We have come so far here, and we are doing so well. And so many of you are counted in this now. So many of you are moving the needle every day by speaking up, by teaching more multiculturalism in your classes, through the leadership of the School of Leadership Studies, and the fact that all of that is incorporated in the curriculum there so that we can turn out diverse and caring leaders, So many of you are attending these events. So many of you are supporting the efforts in your colleges and in your units. I'm convinced that we are looking for the right line and we are massively moving toward it. This is a huge credit to K-State. When we talk about the Wildcat Nation, when we talk about this being a family, Dr. Bosco, where you clearly are our father, and where clearly there are many mothers, I'm convinced that we're trying to bring the type of meaning to the word family at K-State that we're trying to bring to the word true democracy, true justice, true equity, true inclusion. Those of you who know me know that I have a problem sometimes with that word inclusion, because I don't think we actually even know what we're talking about when we're talking about inclusion. Dr. Pritchy asked me, Dr. Smith asked me, he said, so what are you reading lately? Well, I said, aside from my memos and the case at my K-State today, the reports and my financial statements, and but between all of that, I'm reading about inclusion. I'm reading about inclusion because I want to do something major on that. But I'm convinced about K-State now. We're on the right track. I don't think it matters now who comes or who goes in any particular position. This thing now has what we call in psychology functional autonomy. It means that it will go on without those who may have been the impetus. It will go on without those who maybe were the engines. Because now, so many of us have stepped up to embrace this and to try to do something ideal right here in the middle of the plains, in the most maybe unlikely place. We're going to have the most major example of what it means to have a truly diverse, inclusive, and productive and innovative and going straight to the top type of university community. That's who we're becoming every day. I see it now so clearly. For a long time, I didn't see it. I'm not even sure it was there, but I know I didn't see it. But I can stand before you today, 13 years into this journey, and say to you that I see it very, very clearly. It's everywhere. It's in every place. It's in all of us. We're all looking for and trying to get in the right line. This is so amazing. And so, Dr. Boyer, I hope that you are proud of us. I hope that you approve of what it is that you started and we're trying to finish. That you led and we're trying to perfect. And if each of us would just do something, there's no one of us who will need to try to do everything. So I thank you all very much for being here today. It's been a marvelous week. Everybody has done so much so well. I can't even begin to thank all the people that have done so much to make this week possible. Our president is the reason that you don't get my solicitation letters anymore. He said, you know what, give him a break. He says, I'll pony up. He said, so you don't have to send all those letters out there anymore. So I definitely want to thank our president. And I definitely want to thank all the people in the Office of Diversity. We have not been in the best shape over the last couple of weeks, but I can tell you we have mounted a yeoman's effort to keep the train on the track, moving to our final destination. So once again, I say thank you all very much for everything, big and small, day in and day out, in the spotlight maybe, but also the stuff that's unsung and unseen. It takes all of that and all of us to make this university the greatest example that could possibly exist of a bunch of people that are just striving to be in the right line. I'll never forget that line as long as I live. All right, people, Thank you very much. Next time.